So the story I'm going to tell and the point that I'm going to address and kind of the guiding questions for this session, mainly I'm going to focus on how do you manage the boundary between science and policy in a politically charged environment. And so the story I tell, it's about a project we did that took the tactic of operating simultaneously in both the policy and the science realm, recognizing that freshwater allocation and its use is extremely sensitive historically in Hawaii. So we realized from the get-go that we really needed to straddle those communities and bring them together from the start. Otherwise, we were probably going to have issues and make some enemies and not get anywhere throughout the project. And so in our context, climate was really an umbrella issue that brought these communities together. But like Susie was saying earlier, climate was almost irrelevant in the relative success of the project. It was really more about that integrated science approach overall. So what we did was, in Hawaii, we were working on Maui, and we were creating localized climate projections, downscaled projections, for that island scale in Maui, and we approached utilities about how to use those in their planning, and we were politely rebuffed for a year or two. So we'd call them up, email, say, hey, you want to go to lunch, talk about climate, and people were just mostly not interested. They were very polite about it, but we kept on bothering them, checking in, and at the same time, simultaneous to that process of bothering the utilities, we were also pursuing a policy analysis. So we were using existing entry, we analyzed existing water policy and law in the state to look for entry points for climate change information. So without having to pass new policy. And working with the state legislature and people in state agencies on framing those points at the same time of the policy and water analysis. So we had two groups going simultaneously, kind of the hydrologist and my colleague Melissa Finucane, who many of you know, who's a psychologist. So we were taking the route with the utilities, and our legal scholar, Richard Walsgrove, was going through the policy realm simultaneously. Now, as it happened, we were involved in also pushing forward a Climate Adaptation Act at the state level, being reviewers and partially working with Richard on that policy document to get that through. It passed in 2012, and suddenly state agencies needed to include climate information in their planning. And the utilities were suddenly eager to meet, suddenly returning our calls. They didn't have extra money to do this type of work. They didn't have relative expertise, and we had been bothering them for a couple of years, so they knew who to come to. So we ended up with this situation where water managers and regulators, the policy people, approached the question at the same time, and we were, weaving in and out of that context the whole time. And it was really seen, it was a climate umbrella, like I said, but it was seen as a land and water kind of joint adaptive management opportunity as well. Both of those planning processes were done in silos. Often they weren't talking to each other, so this was an opportunity for them to get in the same room, and a way to work within these existing policy frameworks that Richard had identified all these entry points into. So our integration method was, with a bunch of stakeholders, we co-developed 4 future land use groundwater recharge scenarios under climate projections, with probably about 30 or 40 stakeholders spanning quite a few different sectors. And then one of the outcomes from that is that we were able to successfully predict a large agricultural land use change in one of our scenarios a year before it happened, despite not having any input from that agricultural landowner. So when the land use change was finally announced, the director of the water utility took our scenario that they had co-developed with us, went straight to the mayor, and said, we're ready to go on the future water and climate implications of this land use change. So that we really looked at that as a success. They were involved in the process of creating this scenario, and without input from that agricultural landowner, we're able to predict in one of the 4 scenarios where it was going, and were able to use the outputs to look at groundwater recharge impacts under future climate in that scenario. So after that Maui project really was wrapping up, after that point, a different island's water utility on Oahu actually approached us and said they were interested in doing a similar project. And in that case, this has just started, but they've provided the funding to work with them directly under a larger project. So it's really transitioned from us forcing ourselves on them to co-funding a project. And like previous speakers have said, the water sector is consistently identified as a sector that's most familiar with and willing to incorporate climate model information, incorporated or comfortable with technical information. And that's really reflected in assessment work that we've done previously throughout the state, showing that our water sector feels far more comfortable with climate information than ecosystems, conservation groups, and wildfire management groups. So that's kind of a point. And finally, I have a couple big points that I wanted to bring up in terms of lessons learned. Someone said this earlier, I think it was Adam. As you build your board for an institution, or as you're going forward working with institution, utilizing those stakeholder boards that should have diverse groups represented and diverse interests on there was really helpful for us in getting buy-in from a bunch of different people at both high levels and diverse sectors. Technical audiences, like the water groups, may be more receptive at first, but institutions learn by example of other groups they work with. So again, that speaks to diverse sectors on your board. You can get that across different sectors out of water. But just as we saw on our group, the Maui group, by example, the Oahu group wanted to pursue that same work. Also, the top-down mandate of that State Adaptation Act, coupled with the bottom-up relationship building that we were trying to do, seemed to be crucial in getting something to happen. And finally, each system that we've worked with, not just in water, but in different groups, different sectors, is radically different. So every time I think I learned something, and I go forward to the next project and think I'm ready to get right in there and use what I learned last time, it's a completely different context. So remembering that flexibility is crucial, and being able to work with different groups and recognize different needs across these projects is necessary. And that's my story.